If you white folks want to be treated the way blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
Powerful words from renowned educator Jane Elliott, who first brought up the issue of white privilege in the 1970s when she began showcasing her blue eyes, brown eyes experiment in classrooms across the United States. Welcome to the stream. I'm Malika Bilal.
And I'm Omar Badar. Today we're going to dive into the topic of white privilege and why some believe it's at the crux of race relations in the U.S. It's an uncomfortable conversation for some, but for others, Malika, they don't even know what white privilege means.
You're right. Simply put, it means people of color are not afforded the same opportunities or given the same credit as white people. Nearly 50 years after Jane Elliott started her classroom exercise, the conversation continues on social media. In response to recent police shootings in the U.S. of black men, one Twitter user revived the hashtag white privilege means. It's a challenging concept to put into 140 characters, so some are demonstrating it with images like this vine.
Hey, opposite. You. Hey, opposite.
Now that vine has nearly 140,000 views. So, does white privilege impact race relations and how does it do so? Joining us to discuss this, we have in Seattle, Robin DiAngelo. She is the author of What It Means to Be White and a consultant on issues of race and social justice for over 20 years. In New Orleans, Terri Coleman. She's a professor at Dillard University. That's a historically black college. In Los Angeles, we have Laurie Hutcherson. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of the website Good Black News. And in Washington State, we have Terri Kimpton, who is the co-founder of the online community White Nonsense Roundup, which seeks to help explain white privilege and combat racism on the internet.
Welcome to the stream, everyone. Robin, let's get started with you. What does white privilege mean to you?
Never having to say you're sorry. Essentially, white privilege is the sense of entitlement to rule, the sense of entitlement to be above.
Sense of entitlement. So then what does it mean to be white to you? I know that that's the title of your work. What does that mean?
Well, what it means to be white is essentially to be socialized not to see racism, to deny racism while being thoroughly invested and shaped by racism. So white consciousness is essentially inculcated in the water of racism, the water of white supremacy. It shapes every aspect of our frame of reference, our worldviews, our experiences, and at the same time, that is denied. So it's this kind of split consciousness between, on the one hand, knowing, essentially, I mean, no white person who grows up in the society misses the message that it's better to be white. No one misses that message. It's coming at us 24/7. At the same time, we're taught that to be complicit in that message would be to be a bad person. And then that compels us to deny our complicity. And this makes for a kind of irrational internal stew, where on the one hand, we know what's going on, and on the other, we can never admit to ourselves or to others that we know what's going on. And that causes us to act fairly irrationally in the face of any challenge to white privilege or to our positions.
I saw several of our guests nodding their heads there when you were talking, Robin. Terri Coleman, what were you thinking? What is white privilege, your definition of it, and how does that gel with Robin's?
I think in many ways my definition of white privilege is similar to Robin's. It's the overriding structural facet of definitely American, but I would argue Western and colonial life and society. It's also something that it's so foundational and so important to the core of everything that our collective society is about, that we're all invested in not admitting that it exists because it really is immoral and unethical. For me as a black person, though, as opposed to Robin, who says that, who mentions that white people need to not believe this because they have to believe they're good people. For me as a black person, that means that in almost all of my interactions with white people, I'm constantly navigating, trying to protect their feelings and protect their comfort, and I have to do that even if, in order to be true to myself and to pursue what I need or my community needs, I have to say, hey, white folks, y'all are kind of being horrible right now.
So I'm going to go ahead and jump in right away with the pushback that we're seeing from our online community. So we have people like Joel over here on Facebook who says, white privilege has no true meaning and only perpetuates a stereotype that gives comfort to envy and division. And then we also got a video comment from Joe talking along similar lines. Check it out.
I don't really particularly belong to any movement, whether it's All Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter. For me, every life is precious, and from the ones who are unborn to the ones who are targeted unfairly by law enforcement for the color of their skin, I really do think that we need to work together as a community to fix a lot of the problems that we face today.
So, Terri, Kimpton, for those who see looking at any of this through a racial prism as somehow being inherently divisive, how do you respond to them? Why is it important to talk about white privilege?
Well, I have two thoughts for you. One is that I think it's the ultimate example of white privilege, that somehow we think that we don't have to think about race, and that we sometimes don't think about race, and we've built a whole system in our society where that happens. And it's just something that we can choose as white people to not confront, where that's not a reality for a lot of communities of color. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. That is white privilege. It's a great example of it. But it's also a very normal response if the concept of white privilege is new. I remember the first time that someone confronted me with white privilege, it was when I was in college in the 90s. It's a very normal thing to be like, wait, I'm not a bad person. You know, I'm not that guy. I was raised by a liberal family. I have lots of different kinds of friends.
Do you remember what they confronted you saying? Do you remember that instance? What were they?
It was just a conversation about the existence of white privilege. So it wasn't even that directional, but it still was just kind of instinctive, like, wait, I'm not a bad person. And we somehow have to get over that. We're not saying anyone is specifically a bad person, but we need to educate ourselves. We need to be aware. We need to get involved. If something is unfair for a huge portion of our country, then it's unfair for all of us. And that's just something that we need to get over. It's easy to be defensive and then just stay there.
So it's interesting you mentioned that, and Robin, I hear you, but I want to bring up this tweet we got from someone named Anthony on Twitter who says, the key to understanding white privilege is that most of those who have it, A, don't realize, and B, would flatly deny having it. So we heard, Terri Kimpton, you gave us your example of the time you were confronted with it. Here's another series of examples in this Huffington Post article. Laurie, you wrote this. What I told my white friend when he asked for my black opinion on white privilege. Kind of a mouthful there. You can see the picture, got privilege. So you listed several things that had happened to you over the course of your life. Want to take us through just one?
Sure. One, and it's pretty subtle because at the time I was 17, and the best thing that I'd ever achieved in my life had happened. I'd gotten into Harvard University, and my family was happy for me. Everybody was happy for me. I start doing my preparations to go to Harvard, and I go to the doctor to get my immunization report and a physical, and she says, "What college are you going to?" I say, "Harvard," and she says, "You mean the one in Massachusetts?" And I'm like, well, yeah. And then I'm in the store buying my supplies for Harvard with my list, and the store employee says, "Where are you going?" I said, "Oh, Harvard." "You mean the one in Massachusetts?"
Again.
Again. And then the third time, the kicker, I'm literally in UPS mailing boxes to Harvard. There's a young man, a boy, who's ahead of me in line, who's white, and he's mailing his boxes. And there's a woman behind me who's mailing boxes for their child. And she asked the boy, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Princeton." She says, "Congratulations." She asked me, "Where are you going to college?" I say, "Harvard." She goes, "You mean the one in Massachusetts?" And I literally have labeled boxes right there that say Cambridge.
Right.
And but to me, it was the fact that it happened 3 times, all with white strangers who could not conceive that this black girl they're seeing in front of them could be going to Harvard. Like, they literally couldn't compute, like, maybe. And it wasn't even like they asked, "Could you repeat that? I didn't hear that." They didn't say, "Do you mean Howard?" They literally say, "You mean the one in Massachusetts?" Like, seriously, is that what you mean? And for me, knowing myself, it just really pointed up to me a really, really super subtle form of racial aggression or white privilege. Like, the people who were saying that really didn't even have a clue, and that's, I think, part of it, just that cluelessness of understanding that you are perpetrating a form of racism, even in your daily conversation, that you're just trying to make polite chit chat. You don't realize that you're actually saying to somebody, because of the color of your skin, you don't seem as if you would be able to achieve something like that. And that is a form of white privilege, to be able to go through your life to achieve what you achieve and have people say, oh, good for you, congratulations, not question it, not question, oh, it must have been affirmative action, or that must be a quota position when they got that good job. That just that subtle form of
a quota,
whatever you're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had really similar experiences, Laurie, when in my graduate program. I went to undergraduate at historically black colleges in New Orleans, but I went to grad school at Eastern Illinois University, a fantastic program, but it's in a very small, very, very white town in central Illinois. And when I got into my program, a lot of other people of my cohort in the first few weeks, they kept on saying things to reassure me that they weren't racist, that actually ended up being like super racist things. So they made a lot of assumptions. We all had assistantships and funding, and I actually had the better assistantship out of my entire cohort, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. But a few of them would be like, well, I just want you to know I'm really okay with affirmative action. I'm glad you're here. I'm like, well, I'm great for you for being okay with affirmative action, but I'm here because I got 2 bachelors and I got 4.0s and I was competitive in academic trivia throughout the country, and I was on Black College Quiz, and I wrote fantastic essays and scholarships. Like, why are you making assumptions that I'm here because somebody's giving me something? Did it not occur to you that I'm here because I can compete with you and I might be better than you at what we're competing at?
So we actually have that echoed in our online community as well. We have Andrea over here with a tweet that says, white privilege is feeling at home in America. It was kind of interesting. When we also have Ryan here on Facebook who says, I tried to explain white privilege to white students. It didn't work, so I gave up. It's a waste of time for brown or black people to explain white privilege to white people. They'll never get it unless a white person explains it to them.
So let me give that a shot.
Yeah.
Because I see several threads illustrated in that comment that you showed, the original one. And the first one is this thread of individualism, right? So he leads by saying, I don't see myself this way, right? I'm a unique individual outside of the forces of socialization, which is part of the privilege of being white, is you get to be an individual and see yourself as exempt from the society at large that you are literally swimming in. Also, what other social issue or problem in this society do we think the best approach is to never talk about? So we have to ask ourselves, who does it serve not to talk about domestic violence, for example? Right? Who does it serve not to talk about racism? And then this
why has it been so uncomfortable to talk about it? I mean, that's one of the reasons it's not talked about. It's because it's uncomfortable.
But
that discomfort isn't equal. So for me as a black person, I'm going to be uncomfortable no matter what, because I'm not at home, because I'm moving through a space that's designed for whiteness. I'm uncomfortable before we even start the conversation. That discomfort,
See, white folks
it's
are
us
entitled
protecting
to be
white
comfortable.
folks.
Yeah, we move in a racially insulated environment in which we are comfortable 24/7, right? The status quo is comfortable for white people. And so when you interrupt that, and any question of our entitlement to our positions is to interrupt that insulation and that comfort. And what emerges is what I call white fragility. We cannot handle it, we cannot sustain it, and we will do whatever we can do. And often it functions, I see it as a form of bullying, right? I'm going to get you not to do that again. You will not question my position. You will not question my access to everything. And you hear it in the tweet the person wrote, I just gave up challenging white people. We make it so miserable, so punishing to question this that people just stop. There's one more thread I want to name in the original comment, which is that lack of humility, right? So that you're talking to 4 people up here who, for their living, are educated and deeply immersed in this conversation. This is the most complex, nuanced social dynamic since the beginning of this country, right? And yet he just makes this claim that's, quite simplistic. We've all heard it. And rather than say, here's what I'm thinking, what are your thoughts? Or can you help me? What am I missing? It's just put out as if that opinion is equal to those who live, breathe, study, or struggle through this on a daily basis.
So
And it is-
I hear you there, Robin, but then I want
Yeah.
to I want to throw something else at you, because when this conversation happens, we inevitably hear this argument here, and so I want all of you really to take this on. So this is Nimble Navigator, who saw the topic of today's show. He writes in, yeah, ask the people of Appalachia how they're enjoying their white privilege. Another person kind of picks up on that theme and says, one problem is that poor whites don't feel, quote unquote, privileged. So the term white privilege may not be the best name for this phenomenon. Terri, Kimpton, do you want to address that?
Sure, I'm happy to. You know, I think life has hardships for everybody. And so it's tempting, if we're feeling economic pressures or family pressures or, you know, grief, disappointment, all of the things that we experience commonly, it's hard to be like, wow, someone could be experiencing an additional level of hardship on top of that, which is exactly what happens. You know, yes, you can still be struggling in your own life, but not subject to the same discrimination and systematic oppression that people of color face. And that's something really hard to be like, yeah, life is hard. Can you imagine how much harder it would be if you weren't also benefiting from the color of your white skin?
Yep. So we have people in our online community who are talking about what white privilege means. So we have Sumaya here, who works at Al Jazeera, actually, who tweeted in saying, watching dystopian movies like The Hunger Games and not recognizing that that kind of oppression actually exists. And we have Sani over here who says, it's when people don't understand why third world passport holders need visas when they go to places, when they go to visit places. But I want to switch gears here a little bit. Laurie, I have male privilege. I can walk late at night after midnight, walk home from a party and not worry too much. I have tall privilege. If I go to a concert, I'm not worried about who I'm standing behind. Is there something fundamentally different about white privilege that deserves a separate conversation, or do you see it as just another form of privilege?
The term white privilege, actually a white professor coined it. So it's so funny, particularly in the comments I've gotten from my article, how people are blaming the black community for being divisive for coming up with the term white privilege. We didn't come up with it. We're just using it because it's a tool that people understand. And the word privilege people bump on, particularly if they're white, because they think privilege means money. They think privilege means education. And there is educational privilege, and there is male privilege, straight privilege. There are many privileges. There's intersectionality. There's a lot to discuss. However, I think the core one being racism, because that is how the country was founded. I mean, somebody tweeted me and asked me, do you consider it black privilege to have Black History Month? And it's like, no, I consider March through January to be white privilege. You know, it's just that we look at the term and we use it for a springboard to conversation, because as Robin was saying, a lot of people, and Terri was saying, there are a lot of people who have hardships and who are in pain. A lot of people, everybody has it. And so some of the comments when people write in saying that, like, I went through this, I went through that, black people, I lived in a black community and I was treated like crap. People can be horrible, people can hate, people can be bigoted no matter what color they are. However, systemically, this society and historically, people have to recognize and understand that it was set up for white males to prosper. That's how it was set up, and it has continued for the past 400 years to be that same way, and it just keeps changing in iterations, but that's what it's set up to be, and that's what we're asking people to acknowledge and to move forward and to have conversations so that we can all be created equal. We all can have the equal opportunity, regardless of who ends up first at the finish line, that everybody sees that everybody should be having the same opportunities and be viewed the same way, regardless of the color of their skin. Mm-hmm.
You know, Laurie, it's interesting. You mentioned that this needs to be acknowledged. So one of the conversations I've seen online is some recent events in current news that people have pointed a lens at, basically the media coverage of these recent events. So behind me, you see two photos. These are of two convicted rapist college students. One is Corey Beatty, a university football player who was found guilty of aggravated rape. The picture behind me, the African-American, it's his mug shot. On the other hand, though, you see Brock Turner. He was in the news because people thought his sentence wasn't harsh enough, also convicted of rape at Stanford University. And the picture you see behind me is a student photo. He's smiling. It's not a mug shot. So, Terri, do you think the problem is not acknowledging that this is a problem, or is it beyond that? Have we acknowledged it, and then what do we do? Where do you lie with that argument?
Which Terri do we mean? There's both of us.
Good question. Terri Coleman, you want to take that on?
Sure. I think part of what's happening is what Laurie, I think it was, mentioned, that from the get-go of our society, we've established from the very beginning that we are wrapped up in enshrining white male supremacy, white male access. So if we go back all the way to, oh gosh, I might get the year wrong. I think it's 1676. It might be 1696. We have Bacon's Rebellion in the Virginia colony. And this rebellion was blacks, whites, and natives, all unfree laborers, rising up against the landed gentry. And the response to squashing that rebellion was legislation that enshrined whiteness as equaling freedom, gave white people, all white people, regardless of class, the right to police and kill all black people. It enshrined blackness as slave. And so when we go that far back and see in our shared imagination, in our cultural and political imagination, in our shared self, that we enshrine whiteness and blackness these ways, it's not difficult to see how we get to 2016 and we say, hey, if blackness is inherently slave, inherently dangerous, inherently needs to be policed, and whiteness is inherently free, inherently valuable, inherently human, then it makes perfect sense why we say, hey, this white boy who did this horrific thing, he's still a person who made a mistake. This black boy who did this horrific thing, that is inherently his nature. And that's what we're seeing in these pictures. And so when we don't, I think a larger issue isn't that we fail to acknowledge it, we fail to acknowledge the larger web. We can talk about Bacon's Rebellion, we can talk about Tignon laws and sumptuary laws in colonial Louisiana that said women of color had to wrap their hair to have a visual marker to make sure that everybody knew you were black, even if you were light-skinned. We can look at the Tulsa race riot. We can look at all these things. So, what we refuse to do is look at them as connected because that implicates whiteness.
Yeah, we do have some more comments about what white privilege actually means. We got a video comment from Nancy. Take a listen to it.
I just want to say white privilege is a racist shirt in every way possible because in everything that they do, white people want to erase the humanity of others. It's not even about pushing others out of the way. It's more about killing the existence of others. In its essence, white privilege is saying, if I erase your humanity, then I own your space. Because ultimately, only I can do better with that space.
So Terri Kimpton, when she says, in everything they do, white people want to erase the humanity of others, I mean, it seems to imply that there is malice here at play, which I'm sure is not only inaccurate, but can be actually flat out counterproductive. Do you think it's important for people who are talking about white privilege to be cautious in the way it's framing if ultimately the goal is to educate people about what their privilege actually means?
I do think that tone makes a difference in how we talk about it, but that it is essential that we hear these voices. I mean, I think a big part of white privilege is feeling like we have the right to be speakers instead of listeners. And so that's a big thing that we need to change, is to sit down and hear these stories, hear these experiences, and start to connect that. I don't think there are as many malicious people as there are unaware people who continue to support unequal systems, unjust systems, and take advantage of their white privilege without understanding how devastating its effects are. I mean, it's amazing that there's a whole group of people in our country who feel like it's okay to prioritize their own comfort and their unwillingness to have an awkward conversation, and that that's somehow more important than violence and oppression. You know, there's a big inequality. And so, yes, it matters how we talk about it, but at the same time, we need to talk about it. We're definitely in our project still learning and figuring things out as we go. So what we say may not be perfect, but we have to say something. We have to start trying. We have to start opening this dialogue and saying to each other, holding each other accountable, you know, this is problematic and this actually hurts people. And let me share some of these stories with you, like the one we just saw.
So
and it's on white people
we
to
only
feel
have about 20 seconds before we wrap up. So show of hands here. Who was talking about this then with their friends and family members? All right, all hands were raised there. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time in the main show, but a big thanks to our guests and, of course, our community for joining in on it.
And, of course, the conversation continues online in our post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Until next time, we'll see you there, and be sure to keep tweeting in the hashtag StillAJStream. Welcome everyone to the Post Show. Let's jump right back into the conversation. We were talking about white privilege. I do have a video here that I want to play. It requires a little bit of setup. This is basically a black woman who was going through the grocery store. Her sister-in-law, who looks white, had just gone before her, paid with a personal check, no issues. And then when she tried to pay with a personal check, the cashier asked for multiple forms of IDs and was checking the book. And I'll let her pick it up from there. Take a listen.
So the manager walks over and says, "Is there a problem here?" And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, "Yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened." So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" What?
So, Robin, this could be an example maybe of people saying somebody using white privilege for good to actually challenge racism. Can you think of ways that white people could actually use their privilege for good purposes?
Oh, definitely. And by the way, that was Dr. Joy Leary, the brilliant author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Yeah, absolutely, right. Racism depends on the silence and apathy of so-called good whites, right? So when we talk about police brutality and police violence, and I do not relate to that, and I don't think the average white person relates to that. And so that sets up a reinforcement that racism is only these extreme explicit acts and that I have nothing to do with it because I would never do it and I'm good and I have friends, etc. But that cannot go on without our complicity, our silence. Without our separation, right? We live separate and we don't see what's going on in other spaces. And so then as long as you keep those people out of my good neighborhoods and my good schools, then whatever happens there, I don't really care. I don't really know about. Just keep it separate from me. And I really believe you have to connect white people to this. We have to see that it depends on our silence. So when that woman spoke up in the grocery store, she broke with white solidarity. And white solidarity is the unspoken agreement amongst whites that we'll keep each other comfortable around our privilege. We won't challenge each other. We won't call each other out. And in doing that, we keep it intact. So building the capacity to keep race on the table, to and sometimes when you're interrupting it, it's not just for the other person, right? I might not be able to affect that other person at all, but it's really healthy and important for me to break silence, right? For me to speak up, even if it's inelegant and scary and awkward. To not do that is not only to collude, but to hold my privilege in place.
Interesting. You know, Laurie, sorry, go ahead, Terri Kimpton.
I was just going to say that something that we see is at the very least, when you speak up, especially if it's within friends and family group or in public spaces, you are telling the people of color, you're not alone. I see you, I recognize what's going on. And even if you don't have any particular connection together, you're standing up and saying, you know, this isn't just up to you to fight, that, you know, we are trying to change the dialogue. Let me take some of that burden from you. You know, our online group, White Nonsense Roundup, is designed exactly to do that. It's an unfair burden that we place on people of color. Not only do you have to deal with oppression and systems that do not benefit you, but in addition, somehow you're supposed to prove it exists, educate white people, and then also reward or praise them for being just kind of a normal, decent human being. That's really unfair to put that burden on top of everything else that's going on. And so we're trying to encourage people, white people, to step up and take action. And we hope to be a resource for tools and conversations so that they feel empowered to go do that.
And you mentioned your group, White Nonsense Roundup, so I pulled it up here. This is a profile picture that I chuckled a little bit. Days without white nonsense, 0. The commenters seem to like that as well. Just one more thing from my computer, and Laurie, I wanted to pass this off to you because we got this tweet that kind of summed up what I think what a lot of people might have trouble with. And so privilege means, that's the handle, says when you're used to having all of the pie and choosing who gets a piece, then things get ugly when others demand fair representative share. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would agree with that statement because, I mean, I don't want to boil it down to this reductive thing, but it is almost like dealing with children in the sense of if you're used to having your toy and someone says, hey, you've had the toy all this time, we're all in the class together, I think I should get a turn with it. No, 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 mine, 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 mine. I don't want to share the toy because it feels like you're giving something up, as opposed to perhaps having an even better experience playing together. So it's not that basic, clearly, because if it were, we could solve it, because these things do get solved in preschool. But I found that since I've written my article, look, I was asked by a friend from mine from high school, and it's printed. You could see how he asked the question, and he asked that he tagged all of his Black and mixed race friends to try and explain white privilege to him, and I'm boiling it down. But the first couple of responses were kind of like, white privilege is being able to tag your friends on Facebook and ask them
to explain a huge concept. Yes, right.
Which was hysterical, but it wasn't, in my opinion, actually going to be helpful, because to me, I was looking at it like, look, I think I know this person. He's an intelligent person, and he's trying to understand something that he's just not understanding. Let me take the time to really try to get through, because at my core, I have hope in people. I believe that it's possible for people, if they have the right information, the right mindset, perhaps even the right spirit, that they can learn something and they can make a change from that. And as a result of me writing that, and I'm really happy I did, just from the flow of people who I don't even know, a lot of white people, male, female, have said, this was eye-opening for me, this connected to me, this explained it to me in a way I've not been able to understand it before. And I think it was because it was a friend-to-friend conversation, and because they sensed I was being sincere in trying to answer this question, even though it was exhausting and draining, and perhaps not necessarily my responsibility to educate somebody on this, that I took it on anyway, because I really don't want people to not understand it who have the potential to
Laurie,
get it.
I think I read Laurie's piece, and I very much appreciate that she was willing to do that. And I think other Terri's program with the No White Nonsense is another good example of this. But one of the things Omar said before the show, before we came to the post show, is can that tone be counterproductive? And I think all of those together, what you see is this another piece of white privilege, which is that whiteness, people who align with whiteness, feel like they're entitled to the thoughts, the emotions, the physical and mental space of people of color. Why on earth is it our responsibility to educate you? I get paid to teach classes. Laurie, you get paid to teach classes. You get paid to write books. You did free labor for that man, and that's your choice, and you chose to do it. I do that free labor. I'm married to a white man. I do that free labor for my white husband and my white family. But one of the things
does it ever get exhausting, even within your own family, Terri?
It's extremely exhausting in my family. It hurts. It is a revisiting of childhood trauma. I have to think about my first sleepover when I was in elementary school, when I unbraided my hair and the woman whose house I was sleeping over at said I didn't know N-word expletive had blonde hair. And I have a million experience of this over and over again. And I think this constant thing of we have to educate privilege. We have to educate whiteness. They assume that we are going to do it, and we have to be nice while we do it, is some BS. And it's one thing when someone like Laurie chooses to, and even that, if you read her response, which I thought was awesome and hilarious, it takes so much time and energy, and it's so much centering of childish white feelings. And I don't think it's fair to consistently ask Black people to do that for free when we have an entire canon of knowledge and statistics and data that goes back decades. Like, when did Langston Hughes write Dream Deferred? When did Frederick Douglass write his narrative? When did Phyllis Wheatley write things? Like, why are we still doing this for people who don't want to hear?
I actually suspect. Go ahead. I know Terri Kimpton, you wanted to jump in?
No, Laurie wants to jump in. I just really quickly wanted to say to Terri, I hear everything that you're saying. I actually, even in the piece, say that I was actually thinking about it, because I was thinking, you know what? I do want to share these things with my white friends and frankly, like people in my family. When I did this, they didn't even know some of these things. We have been so conditioned to not speak about it, or to just get through it, or to not. I did it a lot for myself as well. As, in addition, it wasn't just for him. It was for me to say, you know what, I've been going through this my whole life, and I'm going to say something about it, and I am going to continue to share and speak out about it in whatever way I can in the moment. You know, there were moments that I described in my piece where I did go through the roof, and it did infuriate me that this was happening in the moment. This was a time when I could be thoughtful and considered, because I really wanted to put down what happened to me, or some of what has happened to me in my lifetime, to say, do you get it? Because if you don't get it now, then this might be our last conversation.
But just on the comment that I was making earlier, it was less about whether any person of color owes any white people to educate them, and more about whether, if you're going to engage in activism, whether there are more productive ways to do it than others. But I do want to squeeze in this tweet here by Sublime, who says, speaking from South Africa, saying white privilege there has existed and been entrenched for over 300 years. Equality is going to take centuries. And I actually do want to toss this to Terri Coleman. Given the fact that we have shifting demographics in the US and white people are not going to be a majority anymore in about 30 years is what the estimate is, how far ahead do you think white privilege is going to remain a thing?
I think white privilege will remain a thing until we dismantle whiteness to the point where it is no longer a useful social category. You mentioned that white people will no longer be the majority. White people weren't the majority in the antebellum South. We were. White people weren't the majority on slave ships. We were. White people weren't the majority in apartheid South Africa. Black people were. An issue here isn't majority and minority in numbers. It's whiteness being a socially useful category that gives someone power.
So I want to give that same question to all of our other guests as well as their final closing thoughts, because we're running out of time. We will be kicked off the internet if we go much longer. So Robin, you want to address that?
Yeah, well, I think Laurie beautifully laid it out. It's not going to end in my lifetime. And it's not about numbers, it's about power. White men are approximately 34% of the population, and I don't want to get out from under it. I am white, I'm not male, but I am white. It's always about power, and power concedes nothing without a struggle, as Frederick Douglass said. It's deeply entrenched, it's normalized, it's taken for granted. And it's not going it's not going to end in my lifetime, but to not seek to interrupt it and to address it is to collude with it. There is no neutral space. The default of our society is the reproduction of whiteness and white supremacy. So to not intentionally seek to interrupt it is to collude with it.
Terri Kimpton, your final thought in a sentence?
Sure. I think that the other Terri really nailed it. But I'll just add, the only thing that I know for sure is that the more involved we are, the more engaged we are, and the more accountable we hold ourselves and each other, the more quickly it will happen. So I don't know how long it will take, but I do know that it's going to take a lot longer if we don't get involved.
And Laurie?
Yeah, I have no idea if it will end in this lifetime or not, or my lifetime or not, but I have children. I'm probably not the only one who does. So to me, it's worth it. It's worth continuing to have these conversations. It's worth continuing to explore this subject and to try to disrupt and dismantle this system, this political system, this social system that is so unfair to so many people. And to just keep doing it friend to friend, programs like this, education, classes, it just needs to be spoken and it needs to be acknowledged, and hopefully change will come.
Well, a big thanks to all of our guests for having this conversation on television and on the web. We're all out of time, but I want to thank Robin DiAngelo, Terri Coleman, Laurie Hutcherson, and Terri Kimpton, and of course, our community. Until next time, we'll see you online.